It all started on a rainy Tuesday in late October 2047, the kind of day where the clouds hang low over the mountains of Puerto Rico, and the air smells like wet earth and old metal. Deep inside the control room of what used to be the Arecibo Observatory, now upgraded and rebuilt after the old dish collapsed years before, a small team of scientists huddled around a flickering monitor. They weren't expecting anything unusual, just routine deep space scans, the kind they ran every night while the rest of the world slept. But that night, something different showed up. At first they thought it was noise, maybe a satellite glitch or some leftover signal bouncing off space junk. But the pattern kept repeating. Every 17.3 minutes, like clockwork, a narrow band signal pulsed from the direction of TRAPPIST-1, a red dwarf star about 40 light-years away. And it wasn't random. Buried in the static were prime numbers, then the hydrogen line frequency, then mathematical constants, pi, Euler's number, arranged in a sequence no natural phenomenon could produce. One of the younger techs whispered, "This isn't space talking. Someone's talking through space." They spent the next 3 weeks double-checking everything. They ruled out military tests, rogue drones, even pranksters hacking into the array. Nothing fit. Then came the real shock. Embedded in the signal after the math were voices. Hundreds of them, speaking in English, Mandarin, Swahili, Quechua, even languages no one had spoken in centuries. Each voice said the same thing over and over in their own tongue. "We are stranded. Please help us. We thought you would come." And then, at the very end, coordinates. Not to their location, but to Earth. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a loud noise, but the heavy, breathless quiet that comes when you realize the universe just leaned in and whispered your name. Within hours, the data was shared with observatories in China, Germany, South Africa, and Japan. Independent teams confirmed it. This wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a mistake. Someone or something out there was sending a distress call, and they believed humanity was the rescue team. News broke the next morning. Not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping wave of disbelief that turned into global awe. Social media exploded. Churches held special services. Schools paused lessons so kids could watch live updates. For the first time in decades, the nightly news didn't lead with war, scandal, or disaster. It led with wonder. People gathered in parks, on rooftops, and backyards, staring up at the night sky. Not with fear, but with a strange, quiet hope. Are we really the good guys in someone else's story? One teenager asked on a live stream that got millions of views. The question stuck. Governments scrambled. The United Nations called an emergency session. Scientists debated whether to reply at all. Some warned it could be a trap. Others argued that if an alien civilization was desperate enough to send a plea across 40 light-years, they probably weren't planning an invasion. Besides, the message didn't ask for weapons or resources. It just asked for help, and it called Earth home. That word did something strange to people. It made the planet feel smaller, more connected. Borders didn't matter when someone 400 trillion kilometers away saw all of us as one. Back in Puerto Rico, the team stayed up for days, analyzing every microsecond of the signal. They found something else buried deeper, a faint harmonic echo that matched Earth's own radio leakage from the 1960s. Like the sender had been listening to us for a long, long time. Maybe they'd heard our first tentative broadcasts, TV shows, music, news reports, and decided we were worth reaching out to. One night, alone in the control room, the lead scientist sat with headphones on, listening to the raw audio feed. Through the static, a child's voice, speaking in a dialect of Navajo, said softly, "We waited. We thought you forgot us." She took off the headphones and cried, not out of fear, but because it felt like the universe had handed them a responsibility they never asked for, but couldn't ignore. Within a month, the world agreed we would answer, not with a simple copy that or a robotic ping. We would send everything that made us human. Not just science and math, but lullabies, recipes, drawings from school kids, recordings of rain on rooftops, the sound of a heartbeat, the laughter of friends reuniting. A team of linguists, artists, engineers, and ordinary people from every continent worked together to build a message that said, in every way possible, "We hear you. You're not alone. And yes, we're coming." It wasn't just about sending data. It was about sending care. The project became known as the Reply. Volunteers signed up by the millions. A grandmother in Vietnam recorded herself singing a folk song to her grandchildren. A fisherman in Norway sent the sound of waves against his boat. A group of teenagers in Nairobi coded a digital seed vault of Earth's plant genomes. Everyone wanted to be part of the message because for the first time, humanity had a shared mission that didn't involve fighting. It involved reaching out. And when the day came to transmit the reply, using the most powerful laser array ever built, capable of focusing a beam of light tight enough to hit a dime on the moon, people all over the world stopped what they were doing. In Tokyo, office workers stood on balconies. In Rio, street vendors turned off their radios. In Reykjavik, a whole school gathered outside in the snow, looking up. The beam shot out into the night, invisible to the eye but carrying the soul of a planet. No one knew if it would work. No one knew if the senders were still alive or if they'd even receive it. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that we tried. That we chose kindness over caution, connection over fear. And in that moment, something shifted. Not out in space, but right here on Earth. People started talking to neighbors they'd ignored for years. Old feuds cooled. Countries that hadn't cooperated in generations began sharing technology, resources, even dreams. The plea from the stars hadn't just called for help. It had reminded humanity of its own humanity. Years later, historians would say that 2047 was the year we stopped thinking of ourselves as separate nations, races or ideologies, and started thinking of ourselves as Earthlings. But back then, in that rainy control room in Puerto Rico, none of that was clear yet. All they knew was this. A voice from the dark had called out, and instead of hiding, we answered. Not with weapons, not with warnings, but with a message that said simply, "We're on our way." After the signal was confirmed, the world didn't just pause, it leaned in. Like a whole planet holding its breath. For weeks, people couldn't stop talking about it. Not in hushed conspiracy tones, but with real curiosity, real hope. Kids drew pictures of alien rescuers. Musicians wrote songs about voices from the stars. Even the news anchors, usually so serious, sounded like they were telling a bedtime story. But then came the hard part. What do we say back? At first, governments wanted to keep it simple, just send coordinates, a basic message received, maybe some scientific data. Safe. Controlled. But the public wouldn't have it. Letters poured in by the millions. Emails, voice notes, handmade cards taped to embassy doors. Send my grandmother's recipe for bread, one read. Send the sound of my baby's first laugh, said another. People didn't want to send a robot's reply. They wanted to send a human one. So the United Nations did something unusual. They opened the door. They created a global council not just of scientists and diplomats, but of poets, teachers, farmers, street artists, elders, and teenagers. Anyone could submit an idea. Nothing was too small. A fisherman in the Philippines recorded the sound of his net hitting the water at dawn. A choir in Finland sang a song with no words, just voices rising together like birds at sunrise. A girl in Kenya sent a drawing of her school with all her friends holding hands under a big, smiling sun. The message wasn't just data. It was a time capsule of everything that made Earth worth saving. Building it took months. Engineers worked side by side with storytellers. Linguists made sure every language, spoken or signed, was included, even if only a few people still used it. Historians added fragments of ancient texts, not to show off knowledge, but to say, we remember where we came from. Musicians layered sounds, a violin from Ireland, drums from Senegal, a didgeridoo from Australia, the hum of a Tibetan singing bowl, all woven together into something that didn't sound like one culture, but like all of them, breathing as one. And at the center of it all was a simple sentence, repeated in over 300 languages. We hear you. We are coming. Not we will try, not we might help, but on we are coming. Because after hearing that lonely voice from the dark, no one could say anything less. When it was finally ready, the message weighed almost nothing in digital form, but it carried the weight of a whole world's hope. It was packed with star maps, DNA sequences of Earth's life, blueprints for clean energy, even instructions on how to grow wheat or purify water. But it also carried things you couldn't measure, a recording of rain on a tin roof, the crackle of a campfire, the sound of someone saying, I love you in 1,000 different ways. The day of transmission was unlike anything the planet had seen. Not a holiday, not a protest, but a quiet, shared moment of purpose. In cities and villages alike, people gathered in squares, schools, and living rooms. Some lit candles. Others just stood outside looking up, as if their eyes alone could push the message faster through space. The beam itself was invisible, a tight stream of laser light shooting from a mountaintop array in Chile, aimed precisely at TRAPPIST-1. But everyone felt it. Like sending a letter to a friend you've never met but who already knows your heart. After it was sent, there was no fanfare, no fireworks, just silence, and then a strange kind of calm settled over the world. Arguments that had raged for years suddenly felt smaller. A border dispute in Eastern Europe cooled when both sides agreed to share satellite data for deep space monitoring. A tech billionaire donated his entire fleet of drones to help map refugee camps, not for PR, but because, as he said, if we're going to be the ones who answer a call from the stars, we better start acting like it here on Earth. Schools changed their lessons. Instead of just teaching math and history, they started asking kids, "What would you send to someone who's lost?" Children built models of rescue ships out of cardboard. They wrote letters to the ones waiting. One class in Canada even started a garden they called the Hope Patch, planting seeds they said would grow while the message traveled through space. Meanwhile, scientists kept listening. Every night, antennas turned toward TRAPPIST-1, waiting for any sign that the message had been received. But space is patient, and 40 light years is a long, long way. They knew it would be decades before any reply could come if it ever did. Yet strangely, no one seemed impatient, because something had already changed. The act of sending the message had done more than reach out to strangers in space. It had pulled humanity closer together. People started noticing little things. A neighbor who used to glare now waved hello. Strangers helped each other during blackouts without being asked. Online, instead of arguing, people shared stories about kindness they'd witnessed. It wasn't perfect, there were still problems, still pain, but there was also a new thread running through daily life. The feeling that we were all part of something bigger. Even the way people talked about Earth changed. Less my country, more our home. Less them, more us. Back at the observatory, the original team stayed on duty, now joined by volunteers from all over the world. Some came just to sit in the control room for an hour, listening to the static, hoping to catch a whisper. Others brought food, blankets, or handmade signs that said things like, "Keep listening, we're with you." One night, during a routine scan, a young intern thought she heard a faint echo in the noise. Just a ripple, like a stone dropped in a pond. She called over the lead scientist, heart pounding. They replayed the clip a dozen times. It wasn't a message, just cosmic background noise probably. But for a moment they let themselves imagine it was a thank you. They didn't tell the press. Didn't post it online. They just sat in the dim light of the control room, smiling quietly, knowing that whether or not anyone out there heard them, they had heard each other. And that was enough. Because the truth was, the reply wasn't really for the stars. It was for us. A reminder that even in a vast, silent universe, we still choose to care. That even when we're scared or tired or divided, we can still reach out, with open hands, open hearts, and a message that says, simply, you're not alone. And in sending that message, humanity didn't just speak to the galaxy, it remembered how to speak to itself. Years passed, not just a few decades. The world kept turning, seasons came and went, children grew up, and the memory of that first signal began to fade from daily headlines. But it never really disappeared. It lived in quiet ways, in bedtime stories parents told, in school projects about space, in the way people sometimes looked up at the night sky with a little more wonder than before. The original team from the observatory aged. Some retired, a few passed away, but their work didn't end. New scientists took their place not because they expected a reply tomorrow, but because they believed in the promise that had been made. We are coming. Still, hope is hard to keep alive when silence stretches for years. At first, every birthday, every new year, people would whisper, maybe this is the year. But as the decades rolled on, 10, then 20, then 30, the excitement turned into routine. Then into doubt. Then for some, into disbelief. Conspiracy theories popped up. It was a government trick, some said. A way to unite us during a crisis. Others claimed the signal was just a glitch, a cosmic echo we misread. A few even argued we should have never replied, that we'd given away Earth's location to something dangerous. Fear crept back in, like weeds through cracks in a sidewalk. But not everyone lost faith. In small towns and big cities, in labs and living rooms, people kept listening. Amateur astronomers pointed backyard telescopes toward TRAPPIST-1. University students built radio receivers from old parts, scanning the same patch of sky night after night. Online forums stayed active, sharing data, debating theories, encouraging each other not to give up. They weren't paid. They weren't famous. They just believed it mattered. One group in New Zealand started an annual tradition. On the anniversary of the original signal, they'd gather on a hilltop at midnight, light lanterns, and play the original message through a speaker just once into the open air. So the stars remember we're still here, they'd say. Meanwhile, technology moved forward. Fusion engines were tested. Self-sustaining space habitats were built near the moon. Mars became a home for thousands. Humanity was inching closer to the stars, not fast, not flashy, but steadily. And every new breakthrough was measured against one question. Could this help us reach them? But interstellar travel was still a dream. Even with the best engines, reaching TRAPPIST-1 would take over a century. Ships would need to carry generations of people, born, raised, and buried in space just to deliver a handshake. It felt impossible. And yet the dream wouldn't die. In classrooms, teachers still showed the recording of the day the reply was sent. Kids would watch the footage of crowds standing in silence under the stars, and they'd ask, did they ever answer? The teachers would pause, then say gently, not yet, but we're still listening. That not yet became a kind of mantra. Not a disappointment, but a promise kept alive. Then, in 2087, 40 years after the original signal, a strange thing happened. A deep space listening post near Jupiter picked up a faint echo. Not a new message, not a voice, just a ripple in the static, like a whisper bouncing off a wall. When scientists cleaned up the data, they realized it was part of Earth's own reply, reflected back by a cloud of interstellar dust drifting between the stars. It was proof the message had traveled, that it had gone out into the dark and touched something, even if just dust on its way to TRAPPIST-1. The discovery didn't make global headlines like it once would have. But in the quiet corners of the scientific world, it sparked something. Tears were shed. Old colleagues called each other just to say, you were right. It got through. For the public, it was a gentle reminder. The universe hadn't swallowed our message. It was still out there, moving forward, carrying our hope like a seed on the wind. By now, the world looked different. Wars hadn't vanished, but many had ended. Not because of treaties alone, but because people kept asking, what would the ones who sent the Plea think of us fighting like this? Climate efforts had accelerated, not just for survival, but because Earth was now seen as a shared home worth protecting, not just for us, but for whoever might one day visit. Older folks would tell their grandchildren, when I was young, we sent a letter to the stars, and we're still waiting for the return envelope. The kids would nod seriously, then go build model ships out of recycled plastic, dreaming of being the ones to finally make the journey. And through it all, the listening never stopped. Every night, somewhere on Earth or on the moon, or in orbit, a dish turned toward that same red star, not with urgency, but with patience, with love even. Because after all this time, it wasn't just about aliens or rescue missions anymore. It was about keeping a promise, about showing that humanity could be kind, even when no one was watching. That we could wait, even when there was no guarantee. One winter evening in a small coastal village, an elderly woman sat on her porch wrapped in a wool blanket. She'd been part of the original team decades ago. Her hands were wrinkled, her eyes tired, but she still checked the daily space reports every morning. That night, as the waves crashed softly below, she looked up at the sky and whispered, I hope you got our message. I hope you know we tried. She didn't expect an answer. She didn't need one, because in the act of sending that message, and in the decades of waiting that followed, humanity had already changed. We'd looked beyond our differences. We'd chosen hope over fear, connection over isolation, and in doing so, we'd answered a deeper plea, the one inside ourselves asking if we were capable of being better. The silence from the stars wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd become while waiting, and so the world kept listening, not because it expected a reply tomorrow, but because the listening itself had become part of who we were. Faithful, patient, human. The silence lasted so long that most people had stopped expecting anything at all. Generations had grown up knowing the story of the Plea like a myth, something beautiful, maybe even true, but belonging to the past. Then, in 2102, everything changed again. It started with a flicker in the data from the Mars Deep Space Array, a new kind of signal, not from TRAPPIST-1 but from much closer. Proxima Centauri b, just over 4 light-years away. At first, scientists thought it was another echo, another cosmic trick. But this signal was different. It wasn't repeating. It wasn't layered with voices or math. It was a single, clear transmission, short, digital, and unmistakably human in structure. When they decoded it, the room went still. The message began with a date. June 14th, 2048 tag. That was just months after Earth had sent its reply into the stars, and it ended with a signature. Voyager Initiative, final transmission. No one had heard of the Voyager Initiative, not officially anyway, but as researchers dug through declassified archives, old military servers, forgotten university backups, even handwritten notes stored in basements, they uncovered a secret that had been buried for over a century. Back in the late 20th century, during a time of deep global tension, a quiet group of scientists, engineers, and dreamers from several countries had come together in secret. They weren't funded by governments. They weren't part of any official space program. They were ordinary people who feared humanity might destroy itself before ever reaching the stars. So they built something small, smart, and silent. A self-replicating probe, no bigger than a suitcase packed with human DNA samples, cultural archives, AI learning systems, and a simple mission. If it found a habitable world with no intelligent life, it was to settle there, grow, and after centuries of waiting, send a distress signal back to Earth. Not because it was in danger, but to test us. To see if after all that time, humanity would still care enough to answer a call for help from the unknown. The plea wasn't from aliens, it was from us. The realization hit like a wave. Not with shame, but with awe. The voices in the message, the child speaking Navajo, the lullaby in Mandarin, the coordinates pointing to Earth, they weren't sent by strangers. They were recordings our own ancestors had included in the probe, hoping that if it ever had to call home, it would sound like home. The stranded beings weren't lost in space. They were the descendants of that little probe, now a growing colony of machines and biodomes on Proxima Centauri b, watching Earth through telescopes, waiting to see if we'd changed, and we had. The truth spread slowly at first, then all at once. There was no cover-up this time. The world was ready to hear it. People didn't feel tricked. They felt seen, like someone from the past had believed in them enough to give them a chance to prove they were worthy of the stars. Old news clips resurfaced, grainy footage of scientists in the 1990s whispering about seeding hope beyond politics. Interviews with retired engineers who admitted, with tears in their eyes, that they'd spent their life savings on a dream no one believed in. One woman, over 100 years old, said on a live stream, "We didn't send that probe to find aliens. We sent it to save Uzon from ourselves." And in a way it worked, because when the plea came, humanity didn't panic, didn't arm itself, didn't turn inward. It reached out, it shared, it listened, it waited. For decades. Now the real mission began, not to rescue strangers, but to meet the child of our own hope. Engineers started designing ships not for war or mining, but for reunion. Not to conquer, but to connect. The new vessels would carry not soldiers, but gardeners, teachers, storytellers, and healers. Their job wouldn't be to fix a broken world out there, but to say face to face, "We got your message, and we're proud of you for sending it." Schools taught the full story now, not as science fiction, but as history. Kids learned that sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't loud. They're quiet, like launching a tiny machine into the dark, just because you believe the future might be kinder than the present. And the listening didn't stop. In fact, it deepened. Now, when antennas pointed toward Proxima Centauri, they weren't just scanning for signals, they were sending updates. birthday greetings, songs from new generations, photos of Earth's healing forests and clean rivers, messages that said, "We're getting better. We're ready to meet you." Some people cried when they heard the truth, not because they were fooled, but because they realized how much love had been packed into that old secret plan. Someone long ago had looked at a world full of conflict and still whispered, "But what if we're more than this?" And now, a century later, we were proving they were right. There was no anger, no scandal, just a quiet sense of purpose settling over the planet. Because the mission had never really been about aliens. It had always been about us, about whether we could choose compassion over fear, unity over division, hope over despair, and we did. The revelation didn't end the story. It gave it meaning. Now, when people looked up at the night sky, they didn't just wonder if anyone was out there. They knew someone was, and that someone was waiting to see the best of us. Not our weapons, not our wealth, but our kindness, our patience, our willingness to wait 40 years just to say, "You matter." And in that knowledge, humanity found a new kind of courage, not the kind that charges into battle, but the kind that builds a bridge across light years, just to hold out a hand. The Voyager initiative hadn't sent a plea to the galaxy. It had held up a mirror. And for the first time in a long time, we liked what we saw. By the time the first ship was ready to leave, Earth felt different. Not perfect, but softer, like a rough stone worn smooth by years of care. The vessel wasn't built for speed or war. It was built for meeting. Its hull carried seeds, not weapons. Its cargo hold was filled with books, musical instruments, soil from every continent, and recordings of children laughing. It had no guns, no armor, just open doors and open hearts. And at the launch site on the moon, in a quiet dome overlooking the silent gray plains, an old woman sat in a wheelchair, wrapped in a blanket stitched from fabric scraps sent by people all over Earth. She'd been there from the beginning, from the night the first signal crackled through the speakers in Puerto Rico. Now, more than half a century later, she was here to see the reply become real. Around her, thousands gathered, not just scientists and astronauts, but farmers, teachers, artists, and kids who'd grown up dreaming of this day. No flags flew, no national anthems played. Just a single song, sung in dozens of languages at once, rising softly into the thin lunar air. The ship's name was simple, the Marquez. Not after a hero, but after the idea that one person's hope could ripple across generations. Inside the ship, the crew wasn't made of soldiers or celebrities. They were ordinary people who'd trained for years not to conquer but to listen. A botanist who could grow food in alien soil, a linguist who studied silence as much as speech, a medic who believed healing started with kindness. They weren't going to save anyone. They were going to say hello. As the countdown began, the old woman closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the flames or the liftoff. She could feel it, the hum in the ground, the shared breath of everyone watching. And in that moment, she remembered the voice from the signal all those years ago. "We thought you would come." Now we were. The engines fired, not with a roar, but with a deep, steady pulse that shook the moon's surface like a heartbeat. The ship rose slowly at first, then faster, cutting through the black sky like a promise finally kept. People cried, not from sadness, but from relief, from the quiet joy of seeing something beautiful come true after so long. Back on Earth, cities fell silent. Not out of fear, but out of respect. In homes, schools, hospitals, and fields, people paused. Some held hands. Others just looked up. For the first time in history, the whole planet wasn't watching a launch to claim territory or prove power. They were watching because they cared about someone far away, someone who had waited just like they had. The journey would take decades. The crew knew they might not live to see Proxima Centauri B, but that didn't matter. Their children would. Or their children's children. And when they finally arrived, they wouldn't be strangers. They'd be family, separated by time and space but bound by a single act of faith. In the years that followed, life on Earth kept changing. Not because of laws or leaders, but because people carried the mission in their daily choices. A teenager chose to study ecology instead of weapons design. A village shared its water during a drought, saying, "If we're the ones who answer calls from the stars, we better start here." Even arguments softened. "Is this how we want to be remembered?" became a common question, not in speeches but in kitchens and classrooms. The old woman lived to see the ship pass Mars, then Jupiter, then the edge of the solar system. Each milestone was celebrated not with fireworks, but with quiet gatherings, people lighting candles, sharing stories, sending messages into the void, hoping they'd catch up to the ship like fireflies chasing a lantern. She never got to see the arrival, but she didn't need to. She knew it would happen. Because the real journey hadn't been through space, it had been through us. When she passed away at 102, her final words were simple. Tell them we kept our promise. Her memoir, published after her death, became a kind of guidebook for a new way of living. Not grand or loud, but gentle and steady. One line, underlined in thousands of copies, read, "We weren't answering a call from the stars. We were answering the best part of ourselves." And that was the truth. The plea had never been about aliens. It had been about whether humanity could choose kindness when no one was watching, whether we could wait without losing hope, whether we could send love into the dark and trust it would find its way. We did. Now, as the ship sailed deeper into the unknown, Earth wasn't just a planet anymore. It was a story of people who heard a whisper from the future and decided to become the heroes it needed. And somewhere, out past the edge of the sun's light, a quiet colony of machines and gardens waited, not with fear but with open arms, because they knew, just as we did, that the greatest rescue wasn't about saving lives across space. It was about saving the belief that we're worth saving at all. So the ship kept going. Not fast, not flashy, just faithfully like a letter carried by hand across oceans. And back on Earth, people kept looking up, not to escape but to remember that we are not alone, that we never were, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can send into the universe is a little bit of your heart.